concerned by one, curious around two, and wanted to play a role in three. And I guess these are the three things that kind of kept me awake at night, and also the reason why I get up in the morning. So, my name's Nick, hello. I've been working in the kind of space where sort of property and sustainability overlap for about 25 years or so. So what I'm doing today is just going to share some insights, ideas and projects that I've been working on that hopefully gives you a kind of an idea of my work, really. Ooh, no, back. So I mentioned change in that introduction and kind of looking at mega trends. So these are from PwC, other large organisations produce other ones. I'm not particularly affiliated to theirs. But there's one way of looking at change, and particularly if you then apply the built environment, property construction as a lens to this, you can see what an important kind of factor it plays in looking into our future. So construction, property, globally is the biggest single consumer of resources and the biggest producer of waste. So UK, about 60% of the waste comes from construction. And resource scarcity is conflict, it's pollution, it's all sorts of things. So how we use resources is kind of linked into many of these. Health, our fracturing world, unhealthy kind of social breakdown, poor physical health. We spend, on average in the UK, 22 hours a day inside buildings. So our buildings are massive determinants of our health and well-being. From a climate change point of view, our buildings are the single biggest consumer of energy, 40%-ish, depending on how you measure it, and about 25% of carbon emissions. So the big, really big influence, and obviously the rate of change in climate is causing quite a lot of challenges for our built environment in terms of how well our legacy environment can deal with changes in climate. Demographic shifts, social instability. So 41% of UK construction workforce are due to retire by 2031. So we've got a massive skills issue. We've got, bizarrely in that context, apprenticeships are going down year on year. So I guess the way in which I frame my work is looking at the role that built environment as an industry relates to these in terms of how it impacts them, but also how they impact upon it. So over I mentioned sort of 25 years or so, plugging away at some of this. In summary, that's generally what I've seen. We've kind of gone from a bit of sort of do less bad, don't kill the fish, general kind of an awareness and appreciation of materials and impacts and pollution and negativity around building projects and big bits of infrastructure towards a general shift towards do more good. And it's kind of both. There is a bit of bad that happens there and a bit of good that happens there. And I guess that's sort of where we are now in terms of what you might call sustainable, I guess, and there's a sort of net position. Where I like to work is with a sort of more progressive pioneering organisations, and that's those that are looking at more of a regenerative approach, so more around restoring habitats, those that are looking at more circular practice around materials, so there is no waste, much more fundamental systemic approach that sees the making and managing and shaping of buildings as a catalyst for regenerative change. And it isn't necessarily about doing less. I think, if we get this right, then we'll live better than we've ever have done before, kind of thing. So it's a kind of a positive, has a positive potential. And coming back to how I talked about the impact and the big numbers, significant player that the industry is in terms of global impacts, then if we choose regenerative living as our goal, then our buildings and places and how we make and manage them is a critical part in enabling or frustrating reaching that goal. So, if we kind of drill down a little bit then, what is the industry currently doing to help or frustrate pursuit of that goal? So, again, in super summary, there's a massive focus on the hardware. So if you talk to designers, you're talking to construction companies, you talk to those that manage buildings, you talk to them about environmental impact, you talk to them around sustainability issues. There will be an immediate focus on materials, technology, products. And I know other industries see this, other sectors see this, but I think there's something particularly kind of blokey and territorial about construction, where it's about putting things on top of things in a field, and it's all kind of very immediate. Whereas actually, the behaviours and ways of working are the thing that's actually holding back a bit of progression. There's an over-focus on creation of new buildings and not curation of what exists already. So if we're going to be net zero carbon by 2050, we need to recognise that 80% of those buildings that will be there in 2050 are already built. So we really need to be looking at what we do with what we have, and potentially building less, or building those in a very different way. And then finally, short-term thinking and slow motion doing. Very conservative industry. I mentioned a kind of quite a myopic view of what's within the kind of control and influence. It's about the site boundary. It's very kind of controlled. Not really changed very much since sort of medieval times in many ways, in terms of construction in particular. And buildings are fairly dumb bits of infrastructure in our modern world. They take years to go through design, consent, planning, construction. You want them to be there for a reasonable amount of time, but the use case for them, the demands, the technology, how people use buildings, that rate of change is quicker than it has ever been, and is only getting quicker. So there's a mismatch there between the kind of the dumb hardware and what the software is looking for. So, what do we do about it? So I guess the first point is just say, in my work and reflecting for this talk, I've found this to be true. So thinking about the future allows us to choose what kind of future we want to live in, and how we can get there. And I don't mean that. I don't mean hover cars and meals in pill form and all that stuff. I mean the way we've been working, the way we work most successfully with those in the industry is around trying to imagine the future and ask good questions about it. So, regenerative living in 2030, what does that look like? Once you start to get people to take off their professional hats and you start to try and get them to connect to it as a citizen, and then maybe put their disciplinary hat back on again, you can get much further, I find. So it's about asking good questions. The other one we sometimes use is around projects and risks. So it's 2030 and this particular new scheme has been a complete disaster. Why was that? And that sort of getting out of the now and using what you imagined to look back, I found to be a very helpful way of structuring it. So, Future Ground as a business I founded in 2016, so I mentioned I've been working in the industry since 2000 or so. And I've always had sort of sustainability or environment or something in my job title when I've worked in-house in various different types of organisations, so in developer and constructor and consultancy and designer. And I launched Future Ground as a way of trying to bring some of those insights together into a sort of advisory organisation. So we work with organisations that make and manage buildings and places, and we help them try to create shared value from an environmental, social and economic point of view. So what I want to do now is just talk through 3 ways of thinking and 3 projects that will hopefully illustrate some of the stuff I've been talking about. So, number 1, look for signals. So I guess the sort of other way of looking at this is the kind of the clues are there. So I mentioned the kind of non-progressive nature of building design, building construction, and that kind of industry that manages them. That tends to mean that a lot of buildings, a lot of designs and places are kind of a save as from the previous one. And that's partly because it's so goddamn expensive to do this stuff. But there's very rarely a new brief. You know, you are starting with a lot of received wisdom around what did we do on the last building. Let's just do more or less that. And that means you're missing out on innovation. You're not continuous improvement is missing. You are basically kind of a lot of buildings that are produced as kind of luck, whether they kind of work or not. So I mentioned megatrends earlier. So that, you know, one way of looking at those clues is to look at those big moves. So obviously the picture there is, you know, just an example of the changing nature of the workplace. It's probably one of the best sectors to look at in terms of rate of change. But the megatrend and the mundane, I'll come on to that a little bit in a second. The industry is also terrible at listening to bad news, or takes everything that's negative as bad, constructive, for example. So, listening to complaints and investigating hacks. So how are people using their spaces in a way that wasn't quite as intended, or how are they creating their own environment that works for them? That's a clue. That's a clue to what could be done better. So, yeah. So an example of some of the work I've been involved in. Apologies for the clunky terminology, but building performance and post-occupancy evaluation. What that effectively means is you are going into buildings after people have moved in or started working there, and you ask them how it's going, and you're measuring the building. So this is sort of an industry kind of movement, I guess, that has sort of really gained traction over the last 20 years, but it's still really a minority sport. You know, it's very rarely done. So what it often involves is a lot of resident engagement. So I mentioned residents because a lot of them have been going in housing schemes. So working, following people, letting them show you how they use their home day to day, doing walks and talks around the site with the original design team, say 12 months after it's been used, just looking at what's working and what's not. It can also include some sensors and data, so if you're looking at building performance or air quality or something like that, you can add in that to get really interesting kind of, I guess, sort of quantitative and qualitative say on things like comfort. So just three projects that we worked on, which I thought I would pull out. So one was One Brighton, so the image at the top right. I was project manager for this scheme in terms of its construction and development, but also then led the post-occupancy evaluations. It's a scheme of 170 apartments in Brighton, believe it or not. Very high green standards. It was using sort of non-traditional construction, lots of natural materials, breathable external walls, wood fibre insulation, lots and lots of kind of novel things. And just to pick out one example from the feedback, all of these homes were incredibly low energy. They were designed to be incredibly low energy. But what we found was that through the post-occupancy evaluation, the variation between the most efficient home and the highest energy using home was tenfold difference. Because it was so small, you ended up with such a massive variation, and it actually ended up causing quite a lot of community angst and sort of feedback and finger pointing and all sorts of things. So it's it's sort of an unintended consequence of shining a light on energy efficiency. And what it highlighted was the people who were going to work, maybe showering at work, out of home all day, were using basically naff oil energy. whereas the people who might have be at home with kids or whatever were using a lot more, and it ended up being a kind of a social social reflection. We ran a project with a London landlord and developer in about 7 years ago, which looked at 6 of their office buildings. So we were asking questions around linked to kind of productivity and well-being in the workplace. And one of the examples there in terms of the slightly more mundane was around post rooms. So I mentioned the save as on different schemes. The progression over the last sort of 20 years had been, we're going paperless, why on earth do we need a post room? So you'd end up with these big sort of, tower office buildings that had progressively smaller and smaller post rooms. And in each of the buildings, it was more or less the biggest source of frustration from the building management people was that now everyone's getting their hours and orders to work, and the post room was absolutely awash with boxes, particularly kind of Christmas, and then tales of, kind of like gym benches and 100 kilos of cat food, and all this stuff that just sort of turned up at work.
Oh my God.
So there'd been this kind of, I guess, the mega trend had been, flexible working, paperless office, but actually the clues had been this is going up and up and up, because we are expecting people to be at their desk more often. We need to perhaps be a bit more generous in what we allow them to bring to work. So that was really interesting from a design point of view, so we were able to then pull those clues into the brief for the next set of buildings. And then Wembley Park, so the image at the bottom, working with the developer there, we did post-occupancy there on the first residential building out of what was going to be, I think, 8,000 new apartments, basically wrapping around Wembley Stadium. So a lot of that's now built. In fact, there might even be, I can't remember, they were told different CGI and real. Let's say that's built. They're really interested in how the community was forming. So you had the first block that was occupied in a relatively weird sort of desert of legacy buildings and empty lots, and so we worked with them to ask questions with residents around neighbourliness and connectedness. So how many of your neighbours do you know by first name? How many of your neighbours would you lend a tenner to? But it was really interesting because we used it as a way of engaging the community to then develop a kind of community governance structure that then had a life of its own. So it kind of led to a change. So the cone of uncertainty sounds a bit kind of odd. So I guess the clue here is around the future is more varied and rich than we think it's going to be. And the dogs just say you remember it. Nothing to do with any projects I've worked on. So the future is, we all of us tend to, I don't know, electric vehicles, AI, we tend to narrow down in our language, but also our thinking. The future is kind of, somehow it's kind of moving towards something, whereas in reality, it's doing that. It's always going to have these multiple layers to it. And that's always been the case, it's probably going to always be the case, but that sort of thinking doesn't really help us, I don't think. From placemaking to placekeeping, so kind of that, this term is gets a lot of airtime, right, in terms of placemaking, whether it's sort of from more of an architectural master planning point of view or a regeneration or cultural point of view. But in our work, I guess we're kind of interested in what happens to it in use, and how is that kind of operated, managed, looked after, what's the sense of ownership of that place, how will it evolve over time. So this is the start point, right? That is kind of really, that's the long term, this is the speed bump, that's the kind of the road really. Software and hardware. I think I used the term hardware earlier around sort of buildings and infrastructure. So I guess, so my background's in architecture, and I now get involved in the sort of design of this, not this. So we're kind of involved in how things are governed, controlled, managed, procured, operated, changed, engaged around. We don't do the design of spaces. We work with architects to do that as a kind of an iterative thing. We don't really do that. So I think my kind of takeaway from this is you need to put as much design and effort into the design and delivery of that and how they work together to get places that really fly. So a project example for that one, I just realised they're all pretty massive. So this was, some of you might know, it's Meridian Water in Enfield, so North London Borough. Meridian Water is a scheme for 10,000 new homes, 6,000 new jobs, 10 acres of new urban park. It is a substantial new chunk of city. When we got involved, it's a very bold scheme, I would say. So as well as the numbers, which are quite eye-watering, it's being delivered by a local authority. Glad we're all sitting down. A local authority is going to deliver this. So they're the lead developer. And it has a lot of kind of good, worthy environmental and social ambitions. Carbon positive, whatever that means. Environment positive, yeah, exactly. Zero waste, circular. So it had these incredibly big, bold targets for what this place was going to deliver. But none of the mechanisms for that extended beyond construction. So there's a lot of work going into the design of the streets and the place and the buildings and how it was going to be constructed to reduce waste and be energy efficient. There was nothing at the time in terms of how is it going to be looked after and what happens when something changes. And so we were asked to look at that quite critical third stage, really. I'll show you some things that doesn't really kind of look very pretty. That wasn't really the point. So we basically were looking at, I guess one way of looking at it was the kind of the structure, the organisational structure. So you have homes within buildings, within blocks, within estates. You have some buildings that are owned and occupied, some that are leased, some that are, etc., etc. Wide estate, wider neighbourhood, London Borough of Enfield, London, etc. So we did quite a lot of mapping around, I guess, sort of edges, really, to understand what the different scales were that something needed to work. We also did sort of master plans for services, so this is around sustainable mobility. So just to kind of give you an example of some of the things in here, if you can't read them, so looking at cycle hubs, e-scooter hire, docks, service parking, block parking. So you've got a block management company, estate management company. So we're just starting to map out how those organisations and services would or could hang together, and then sort of overlay it on the physical master plan. We also looked at what we call handshakes and touch points. So handshakes being agreements, because obviously the property and construction is a very, very subcontracted world. So you end up passing stuff down to others very easily, whether it's in a lease or whether it's in a main contract to a subby to a subby to a subby. So getting those handshakes right so that you're able to capture what's important, what's a requirement, and then pass it through, potentially lasting for centuries, is really, really key. And then touch points, again, looking at particularly rich points within the process. So sales and marketing process if you're a new homeowner. Customer bills and invoices, so every month you'll be getting like a service charge bill. There's an opportunity there to kind of engage. And that led to, so this basically sort of hangs off the bottom and goes down about 200 metres into the ground. But basically a huge kind of structure for how you could then integrate those really bold targets into how the place would be governed and managed. So the final one, think in layers. So, some of you might be familiar with the diagram on the right, no, maybe. So, anyone recognise that? It's a bit of a classic. So, 1994, I think, there's a sort of architect and thinker called Stuart Brand, who wrote a lot around kind of why buildings change. So it's based on some work that predated that, looking at office design. So Frank Duffy developed this idea of these shearing layers. So within any space, you have these different layers of, I guess, infrastructure. So if you look in this room, there will be, notices that might change on a weekly basis. There's paint on the wall that might be done on an annual basis. The flooring might be done every 5 years. The walls will be there for 100 years, etc., etc. And so only when you understand that those different layers are there and they all have different life cycles can you start to understand how the building can adapt, and you can reduce the risk of this painful mismatch where expensive, disruptive, waste of materials, etc. So there's a lot of thinking, and this, I guess, I did some work a couple of years ago that sort of started adding digital layers to this, because this was in the 90s when you didn't really have even the kind of internet permeating around your building. So it stops at stuff, paper, computers, things like that. Whereas actually, if you start to look at particularly what a lot of the residents are doing in this building, if you start to get into dynamic, real-time stuff, then actually your rate of change is instantaneous right the way up to 1,000 years. So that thinking in layers thing, I think, is really interesting. And obviously you can apply that into a city as well. We tend to think of cities as sort of overseen, organised plans. No. They're messy, they're layered, they're nuanced, they're slightly chaotic. So in that context, I think all is meanwhile. So this sort of thing around meanwhile space and permanent space, everything is meanwhile. It's just on a different timescale. So I think that sort of thinking we found has driven quite a lot of our work. And in particular, the project I want to talk about is one that we've done with the studio, and it's around this area really. Sort of forgotten buildings hidden in plain sight. Sorry, there's a word missing on that. With fellow resident Jenny Ford, who some of you may know, we wanted to look at. We both got this we've got similar interests. I guess mine is more sort of property and decision-making focused. Hers is more hands-on construction and materials focused. Basically, we wanted to look at a way of sort of disrupting this very linear approach that you get with buildings. That you take a load of materials, you put a building together, you use it, but then the building doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work. It's inefficient. It's inflexible. It's uncomfortable. It's uninspiring. What happens? It sits empty. It gets demolished and replaced. It's a big it's a big event. It's a big carbon event, big resource event. So what we were interested in doing is saying, well, how can you drive to more creative reuse and extension of the life of that building? And in particular, how could you use creative technology to do that? So we put together a project proposal. We were very lucky in that we received Studio Innovation Fund support last year before now? Not in this current cohort, the cohort before, to look at this. So what I just want to do is just sort of run through what we've done and just some of the examples of how we're using that technology. So what the question, I guess, is what if we could use this, and I'll come on to what I mean by increasingly common 3D space capture technology in a second. What if we could use that in a new creative way to disrupt current practice and unlock increased social, environmental and economic value? So, there you go. What technology? So, I've got a picture of it, but we've also got got it here as well. So the heart of the technology we've been using is something called Matterport, which some of you may be familiar with. So it's a camera and scanner. What it does is it basically, you put it in a space, you let it do its thing, it will create you a what's called reality capture. So it will do a 360 photograph, so photogrammetry, to use the technical name, and it will use a LiDAR scanner to build you a point cloud of that space, and then it will bring those two together. So what you're able to do is build models like this very, very quickly, and I'll show you some on the screen in a minute. So that is both a visual representation of the space, and it is also, that will be within a couple of millimetre accurate. And you could scan this room in 2 or 3 minutes. So it's very quick. It's relatively affordable. The kit's expensive, but actually once there are cheaper versions that do kind of 80% of the same thing. But as a technology, it's really interesting because it means you can get a lot of information very quickly. You can use it with headsets, so you can use it to help people understand environments. So if you can't read drawings, you can also add tags, which I will show you in a second. So because it's a model, you can put tags into anywhere in that space. So you're effectively kind of locating that tag. That tag can equally be anything. It can be a video, a PDF, a drawing, a sound file, anything you want. So we were really interested in how, therefore, you could use that as an engagement, as a way of engaging a community around their building. So this is particularly focusing on the Studio Innovation Fund. So what did we do in one slide? Basically, we ran a series of pilots. So we used the technology with Sparks and Scrapstore in Bristol to scan their spaces and to work with them to look at ways that you could use those models to help make their buildings work better, help understand the potential for change within those spaces. We also did a lot of process mapping, which I won't go into detail, but basically looking at how, because the technology is not the thing really, we're talking about a better process. So how could you utilise this tool to streamline and improve the processes that are out there at the moment, and they tend to be, analogue, costly, slow, unimaginative, exclusive. Market engagement, so we did a lot of work with organisations around the potential for this, just trying to understand what would work, what wouldn't work for them. We did some technology mapping, including kind of AI workshops, looking at alternatives. I mentioned Matterport is one of the technologies available. It's probably one of the better ones, or either one of the better ones. The AI side of it was really interesting. As a slight aside, you can, because you're building a point cloud, you can then determine from that model what the building is made of, if you like. So we were starting to use technology. This is a year ago, so it's probably completely out of date now. But you could scan this room. You could tell the model that's a window. It would go, great, if that's a window, then there are 5 of them, and there's this much glass and this much metal, and you've got this much flooring. What's the flooring made of? Great. So if you are refurbishing the building or taking it apart, you end up with a database of what the building's made of. So that's quite cool. We've yet to kind of really work on that. Where has that led to? So we did the pilots. We have had a lot of interest in what we're doing since. So we've done now started doing our first paid commissions, which is great. Jenny and I have launched a little business off the back of this. So this is kind of, it's about a month old now, so early days. And it's kind of focusing on these 3 areas. So engagement and insights. So better understanding what they have and what they need. So scanning existing spaces very quickly. So where if you're building a new building, you might make a 3D model in order to design it and to test it and model it. Whereas with an existing building, it's really unlikely that you would have developed a 3D model. Whereas this can do it pretty rapidly. We were really interested in this. How could it help unlock new uses in existing buildings? So show people what's possible. You can drop the model into a game engine, you can start to then play around with basic objects. So you can do a sort of bit of what if quite quickly, which is really good. And then this last one, to the end of life. How could you use this technology to start to drive a more circular practice in terms of reuse of building elements? So I mentioned kind of using software to determine what the building's made of, but also potentially using it to identify what that object could be if used slightly differently in a different environment. So could that door be a table? Could that, so start to have a creative and maybe a matchmaking opportunity between a donor building and a recipient one. So just to give you an idea of what the technology looks like, so we've done now these buildings. I think that's all of them. I'll just ping up this one so it's open. So Jenny did this one about 3 weeks ago. So you may well have seen them. They were used a lot by high-end estate agents in COVID. So you're able to sell the home from afar. But basically, is it going to really have a history clip now? No, okay. So you're tagging things, right? So you're able to put in different colours, different layers. You can link to video. So this was an exhibition. So where the exhibition itself was only going to be in place for about 6 or 8 weeks. So we were commissioned to do this to complement the exhibition, but also to be there as a kind of a legacy thing. So you're able to, I mean, this is pretty high resolution, so you're even able to use QR codes from it, which is pretty weird. So yeah, and just to kind of give you a rough idea of what, so you can obviously navigate around the space. That can be on a screen, it can be on a headset. You can do this, what they call doll's house view, so you can kind of navigate around that. You can use it to generate floor plans, so switch dimensions off on this one, but I'll show you another one in a sec. And you can also set up tours. So you can use them to guide people around a particular route. And then if I just show you, so Ashton Court Mansion, some of you might know, in Bristol, so this is quite an astonishing space that we were able to get in. So this is the kind of abandoned bit of the building, so fire damage and all sorts of things. So it's a listed form of mansion house that is partly used and partly underused and partly like this. So what we were able to do, we got funding through Historic England to basically develop an educational tour so that they could show people parts of the building that it's not safe for people to get into day to day. So they do tours every so often, a sort of proper hard hat job. But they're really interested, particularly younger people, being able to safely show them around the building. So if I go up to, so you start to get an idea of what it's like in there.
God, you'd never know it was that bad standing outside of it.
No, bits of it are pretty shocking. So, yeah.
You showed me this on the phone and you got enough of an impression. That's such great resolution.
It is good. As I was saying earlier, we had quite a challenge with this because there's no lights in quite a lot of the space. So you see, we got ended up with quite dark shadows, but we were kind of slightly making up the technique as we went because we used this astonishing space with a stair, completely scaffold stair because the original stairs collapsed. So we're currently working with the Friends of Ashton Court Mansion to develop a tour off the back of this. So yeah, I was saying with the lights, because the camera basically does 4 quarter scans, so it's about sort of 30 seconds to do the rotation, a rotation, a rotation. So you have to hide, trigger it with your phone. It does the rotation, but obviously this is the way it looks. So basically, we were stood behind it with 2 lights shot at the ceiling, and every time we went like this, we were like. So it was a slightly improvised technique, but
That
anyway.
explains why some of the early ones, I kept seeing Jenny going like
Yeah. I was, so Ashton Court Mansion. So it was. This is one half of the building.
wow.
So we did. So if I go into here, this is quite a special space. Oh no, that's the plant room. Yeah. So you've got. The ground floor's kind of in corridor. Anyway, the other thing you're able to do is, because it's a model, it immediately gives you all the dimensions. So you can, that's quite handy. So you're getting a 3D thing straight away. You're also able to do it's struggling to keep up slightly. Let's do that again. Yeah, so you're able to measure, say, there. So you can measure straight off it as well. So it's a kind of a creative tool, engagement tool. I think it's pretty good. So that's kind of the end. So so I think thank you for listening. I found it quite therapeutic. If there are any questions around what I've talked about, I realise I covered quite a lot there. I mean, I guess what I've been involved in is quite broad, but I think there's a kind of a common thing. I found it quite helpful to remind myself. It's maybe a bit of a common theme running through it. So happy to take questions now or after the talk.
Yeah, let's have a little round of applause first, shall we? Yeah,